button going. Okay, so shoot, hold on just one second. I had a whole bunch of help from several of you guys finding a book by Dr. Greg Polgrain. He is a professor in Australia, and he's like a recognized expert on Indonesia. So I had already bought a book of his, and oh, there's Stellar. Let me bring her up. I'm not sure, cousin it's off work, and Bridget, I think this week started hunting season in Missouri, so she either isn't going to be here or will be late. So Stellar, it's you and me. Okay, so I had Dr. Greg Polgrain's. He had 2 books, and I've read about half of the first book. And I also bought his book called JFK versus Allen Dulles. And what we're going to do in discussing Indonesia, because there you are. What I didn't realize in having read through a good part of the first one is over the weekend, I happened to remember that I had this other book. And so I started reading it, and I'm like on chapter 5. And so what I realized, and by the way, I was supposed to be doing my bookkeeping. So my CPA is going to be super pissed off at me, but I think this is more important. So what's interesting about the book that I had not opened yet, and then remembered that I had it, was the interplay of JFK's assassination, which we know was Operation Gladio, and Allen Dulles, which is the grandpa of Operation Gladio. If you just look at the book, the title is JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So once I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. And I think you're going to, and we're going to spend a few days on this, because this illustrates everything that I've been trying to reveal to you guys. Every bit of it's involved in this book. The International Syndicate is on front and center display in a way that I have never seen put together. It's crazy. And how, I mean, it even goes into how it's all the marriage between the current royalty in the Netherlands came about, had to do with the International Syndicate and Allen Dulles. And we, of course, know that he was integral in setting up the WWF and the 1001 Club and all of that. And it all feeds back to Indonesia. So I couldn't not go through this with you guys. So we're going to get started, but hold on. I have to say one thing here. One of you guys, God bless you, sent me 56 Pan sent me a response to a post that I made earlier this morning about John Brennan. And he says, question mark, Azov links, who trained Azov, with a salute. And I'm looking at the post that he included in his response being Jack Posobiec. And he basically says, suspect, he's talking about the attempted assassination on Trump, the second one. Suspect has direct ties to Ukraine. His social accounts claim to have been there to get U.S. Trained Afghan fighters into Ukraine to fight on his behalf. Posobiec explains this, the Azov Battalion, propaganda films, and more. And this is his post. Well, if you go on down to his second post, did you know that he wrote a book about the first attempt? I'm sorry, July, August, like in 45 days, you write a book? How a Shot Meant for Donald Trump Took Out Joe Biden. I don't know. I find that simply amazing. Not only did you write a book, you found a publisher, got it published, and it's on Amazon for sale. Okay, said no one else.
There was another case that we came across of the same exact thing. I don't remember what it was. If it was 9/11, Waco, one of the ones we did, where we found an author wrote a book on it, and it was another one of those 45 days.
Yeah.
Almost exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so my response to that was, who initially trained Bandera? Otto Skorzeny under General Reinhard Galen's werewolf program, Stay Behind units, or better known as Operation Gladio. Now, Bandera's units morphed into Right Sector and Azov. They were involved with the CIA in 2004 and 2014 regime change coups. And I put Operation Gladio ran out of NATO, has done this over 80 times since 1948. They, CIA, are in the business of assassinations, yet they are the only ones no one ever mentions when an assassination or attempt occurs. Why is that? The same CIA, according to the New York Times, that has over 20 stay-behind sites in Ukraine. The same CIA that trained all of the Afghan paramilitary fighters. The same CIA that trained the Tajikistan paramilitary that launched from Ukraine into Russia and assassinated 140 civilians. I see a common denominator. And I just sent that because this is the same Jack Posobiec who, for 5 seconds on a show the day after we debuted Operation Gladio in the pond on a Monday night, that he mentioned it for the very first time ever as a quote unquote intel specialist. And he mentions it the next day on a Wednesday on Alex Jones, and it's never mentioned again. So yeah, whatever. All right, back to Indonesia. I had to get that off my chest. All right. So obviously this book is going to focus on the play between JFK and Allen Dulles. And this is one of those books. The only critique that I have so far is it starts in one place and it goes forward, and then chapter 2 and 3 and 4 goes backwards. I'm a chronology freak, and I would rather you just build it from the beginning through, but I'm going to go with the way he has it organized. Usually I take it out of context because I do all of the reading ahead, but I'm just going to leave it the way it is. So, because I haven't technically finished the book, so I don't know if I'd be doing it out of order anyway. And you guys are going to love this because there is so much history here. Okay. So it starts off making the assertion of Allen Dulles, who he is, his brother, Secretary of State for JFK, or not JFK, for Eisenhower, how they were both in those jobs together. His brother, John Foster, dies in 1959 from prostate cancer. And he makes a lot of to-do about the fact that Allen Dulles was Truman's last appointment to the CIA, and yet he was JFK's first appointment. And he also talks about how Allen Dulles was the deputy director of the CIA under General Walter Bedell Smith during World War II, or excuse me, who during World War II had been the chief of staff for Eisenhower. So you have Allen Dulles, who is working for the OSS in the same theater with Eisenhower. And you have General Walter Bedell Smith, who is Eisenhower's chief of staff. And so painting a picture that they probably all know each other from that point. And also at that time, the person in charge of the intelligence for the Allied commander, which is Eisenhower, was a Major General Kenneth Strong. He later became the chief of military intelligence in the UK. And both Bedell Smith and Strong worked with Dulles in Europe. So you have when Eisenhower replaced Truman in 52, Smith mistakenly believed that he would be offered the position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he had already resigned from being the CIA director and was more than just a little miffed that he didn't get to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was moved over to become the Undersecretary of State for 18 months. Smith merely disliked his superior, which of course is Dulles's brother, John Foster Dulles. He also had severe, significant misgivings or he just had a very uneasy feeling about Dulles as well. And in the setting of a peacetime situation. And it says, Allen, whose 2-year tenure as Smith's CIA deputy had been marred by tension, according to Smith. And he said that what really bothered Smith the most is that Dulles had this crazy obsession with covert actions and not intelligence. It was all about manipulation and doing things in the covert operations area and basically no focus at all on the intelligence aspect of the Central Intelligence Agency. Obviously, we've already talked about, and we'll go into more depth of this in a couple of chapters, but both of the Dulles brothers grew up as Rockefeller oil empire aficionados. They basically were on the payroll at Sullivan and Cromwell, with Rockefeller being like their biggest customer. So definitely tied into the international syndicate and served as their reps for an extended period of time, which again, in ways that is going to blow you guys' mind. So there was obviously some misgivings about having them both in the Eisenhower administration. Smith actually proved to be correct. In the first months of the Eisenhower presidency, Allen Dulles began a covert operation to topple the Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, which we've covered. Also in 1954, the Guatemala coup. And there are obviously many that we've covered through 1950 of Allen Dulles favoring that type of quote unquote covert actions. And each and every one of them, by the way, as we have proven repeatedly to include Chile and Lumumba, all of them definitely favored the international syndicate, which in most cases was represented by Sullivan and Cromwell in their previous life. So you see the direct connection of this Sullivan and Cromwell institution and who they represented. And it's like they have their own paramilitary capability, orchestrated through NATO and Alan Dulles' CIA to go out and do their bidding in the world to open new markets or maintain the markets that they already opened. So he also has a dialogue between a guy that was interviewing Dulles after, let's see. So this interview happened, the timing of Kennedy's announcement was even a surprise for Dulles, or so he said in an interview he did after he had been fired in 1964. And he did this interview with Thomas Braden, who we've come across as one of those reporters guys on the take. So Dulles says, well, I'll tell you, I wasn't surprised that he considered my continuance in the job. Our relations were such and our friendship such that I thought that might happen. I didn't think it would happen as soon as this. This happened right after. It was one of the first things he did after the election. Braden says within a day or two. Dulles then counters, I thought that the one thing that could be the most damaging to the agency at the time of presidential change is that if you establish a precedent that when a new president or new director of the CIA or a new party comes in, change the director and get somebody of that same party. I've always felt that intelligence needed to be kept out of politics. I don't think there is a time for anybody to bring a lot of pressure on him, even if anybody wanted to do that. The thought that he thinks intelligence needs to be left out of politics is a laugh in and of itself. He also, of course, kept J. Edgar Hoover on as the FBI director, which was an incredible mistake as well. And it says there were strong political undercurrents in the reasons Kennedy had first retained Alan Dulles. Two reports commissioned by Kennedy soon after his election in 1960, and the other reason harkened back to a presidential debate between Richard Nixon and Kennedy. And basically, what the writer is alluding to is Dulles comes and briefs Kennedy on the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Nixon, because he's the sitting vice president, can't talk anything about it because he knows the classified information about it. So he's not at liberty to even mention the words Bay of Pigs, Cuba, any of that stuff. And by Dulles giving Kennedy the non-classified heads up that something was brewing, Kennedy was then able to use that information to make his position on Cuba well known. And in the fourth of the four debates, it was on foreign policy. And it was during that debate that Kennedy got the biggest bounce after the debate. And by the way, 1960 was the first time ever there were televised debates on television. So this was a huge big deal. And Kennedy felt that Dulles taking care of him and giving him that information was crucial to his winning, which is kind of what gave him the hat tip to staying around. Plus, the author at some point, I'm not sure if it's right now or in chapter 2, goes into how far back Alan Dulles and Kennedy's relationship went. Because of his father, Joe Kennedy, Dulles had spent a lot of time around the Kennedy family. So it was not like they were strangers. And Dulles, as it appears, was basically kind of filling out Kennedy as to, and I mean, this is while he was still a senator and before, because Dulles' whole operation was anybody that could ever be a somebody was going to be looked at and put in Dulles' little black book to be used for later. That's what he was best known for. He would look into people's kids that had no use to him for him at the time. But he cultivated those relationships and then turned those relationships into sources of intel. And that's what happened. If you guys remember the story of George de Morgenschild, the guy that was the white Russian in Dallas that took in Lee Harvey Oswald. And we will get into that because that is touched on as it relates to Indonesia and the oil found in Indonesia. So it all ties together in such a crazy way. So again, they've known each other for a long time. JFK feels like Allen Dulles did him a favor in preparation for the debates. So that does fill in a little bit of the why, because that's always been a question for me. It also says that Kennedy had requested 2 persons prepare separate reports on anticipated transition from Republican to Democrat administrations. Those 2 persons were Columbia professor Richard Neustadt and Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford we've come across multiple times, and let's see, it says he's a Washington attorney, although his former experience included special counsel to President Truman during the 1948 presidential campaign against Dewey. Special counsel for Dewey was Allen Dulles. Dun, dun, dun. Again, he's interwoven into everything. So the bipartisanship in appointing Allen Dulles would have replicated Clifford's earlier contact with Dulles. In finding the best person for the job, Kennedy often adopted a bipartisan approach. He actually ended up appointing 15 Rhodes Scholars, which again, we now know Rhodes Scholars is the CIA/RIIA/CFR recruiting ground for their intelligence apparatus. So that's not necessarily a good thing either. In both reports, Kennedy was advised to retain Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover. Ironically, in May of 1961, which is 4 months after he got in, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, let's see, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy invited Clifford into the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board as well. Neustadt had recommended the directors of 5 sensitive positions remain unchanged. But of these, only Dulles and Hoover was retained. So he kind of split the baby there. And then this is where it goes back and says that Allen and John Foster visited together just after Mossadegh had been ousted. Allen explained to Braden that Kennedy was trying to find out what the facts were. And in 1955, Dulles told the interviewer, when young Kennedy was writing profiles in Courage, he was quite ill. He was laying on the couch. And that's when Dulles said that he went over there multiple times and that he had a relationship. Jackie Kennedy gave me my first James Bond book, and they oftentimes shared books. And he basically goes in and talks about how at that point he was kind of getting his fingers into the pie of the Kennedy background. All right. So between election and inauguration, there were 72 days for Kennedy to survey the domestic and international issues that he was going to encounter on his first day. Chief among those, get this, the Congo, because they're about ready to murder Lumumba, Laos, Vietnam, and Berlin. Also, Cuba and Indonesia. All on the front burners when he walks in. It's like they were setting him up. And we know they do this every time there's a change in administrations. He no longer, once he got into office, was the polite young man that Dulles had encountered in the visits to his home. Dulles said that he had become snappy. On Kennedy's desk was all of these crises, and they had one person in common, Dulles. Dulles engineered and timed to basically blow up on JFK's first several days in office. The crises reached the stage of possible nuclear war in the case of Cuba with the Soviet Union, and the other one, Indonesia, most people didn't hear anything about at all. And so it's almost, you get the idea that this other, which we're going to get into, what was happening in Indonesia was much more significant. And it's almost like the Bay of Pigs fiasco was kind of a cover story being ran to divert attention away from something that is much bigger that was going on in Indonesia. So Allen Dulles's involvement and fascination with the Indonesia archipelago went back as far as the 1920s and 30s, when he first realized the huge potential of the country known today as Indonesia. At the time, it was known as the Netherlands East Indies. And Bridget, if you wouldn't mind, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to cut and paste a few maps, but if you could pull up a map or two of Indonesia and try to get one that's dated like in the 1900s, like 1910, 1920. Because again, this goes back to a couple of 100 years, 300 years of colonialism, this time the Netherlands, and this time what we know today as Indonesia. And the fact that most people knew that Indonesia was going to be one of the richest colonies in the world. But if you guys remember in some of the other discussions that I've said, so I'm going to put the bottom line out there first. I have said that the Netherlands, you remember when we were doing the World Wildlife Fund exposure, that they used geologists under the guise of nature and exploration and mountain climbing expeditions and all this other stuff to go around the world looking for minerals and resources for them to steal. And one of the biggest ones ever found, we've mentioned repeatedly, was in Indonesia. And they found the largest deposit of gold and the largest deposit of oil ever found up to that date. And they hid it. The Netherlands, at the time, they were going into World War II. They didn't know what the deal was, who was going to end up with it. And of course, you know, they had to deal with the Japanese taking over and driving the Dutch out like they had done in Korea and Vietnam, same scenario. And so they didn't want to tell anybody about this big find in case they didn't end up with it. They were going to try to manipulate getting it back or whatever at some future date. So that's kind of where we're going with this. And because I've said it, I want to make sure everybody knows that the importance of Indonesia was gold and oil more oil than could ever have been found in the Middle East combined, all of it. And a bigger gold amount than had ever been discovered. So he talks a little bit about the background and the fact that the Dutch had begun the spice trade from the Indonesia or the Netherlands East Indies. And keep in mind, they called the British had the East Indies, the Netherlands had the East Indies. East Indies is basically Asia. West Indies is basically the Caribbean kind of area when they use those two terms, if you guys have never put those two together. East Indies is the Asian Indonesia area. West Indies is basically the Caribbean area. And it talks about how the Dutch began their spice trade in the 1600s, and basically kind of on par with the British in India, and that there were vessels arriving at the quote unquote Spice Islands and returning to Europe, which generated huge amounts of profits. In the late 1770s, around the time of our revolution, the Dulles ancestors, one of which was named Joseph. Joseph went to the United States. In a brief outline of his early activities, an author by the name of Schrodes, Srodes, explained that Joseph had made his fortune in the Netherlands East Indies. While his background was only partially acknowledged by his descendants, meaning Alan and John Foster, we can, with some certainty, say that he was a Scottish settler in Northern Ireland and that his surname was Douglas, not Dulles. Once the Dutch Indies was pronounced, once in the Dutch Indies, the pronunciation changed to Dulles because of the guttural G in the Dutch language. Joseph's personal history is very murky and incomplete, and you're going to learn why. To make a quick fortune in the Indies at the time, individual traders shipped either slaves or opium. Let me say that again. Slaves or opium. When these occupations were deemed inappropriate in later centuries, it all became quote unquote spice trade. It can be said, on one hand, individual fortunes were made before the British East Indies Company began to tighten a monopoly on opium for China. On the other hand, South Carolina, which was one of Joseph's ports, the same port as almost half of America's human cargo in the slave trade, came into the United States. Whatever the source of his fortune, he obviously considered it preferable to adopt a new name once he was done with that part of his career. So it was that Joseph Dulles, who arrived in the New World in 1779 during the Revolutionary War. With this political heritage, Allen's ancestral line adds a genealogical dimension to his differences with Kennedy's Southern Irish descent. Anybody whose ancestors worked the South Carolina slave trade would seem politically tainted alongside JFK. For Allen Dulles in the 1920s and 30s, when he and John Foster were top lawyers for the Rockefeller oil empire, the initial lure of the archipelago lay in its mining and oil potential. One of the oil fields in Sumatra, operated by Caltex, Caltex, turned out to be the size of those in Saudi Arabia. That's just one. In West New Guinea, now called Indonesia, Papua or West Papua, A primary gold deposit was discovered in 1936, by far the largest in the world. And the deposits of natural gas that were discovered a few decades later now rank among the world's largest. Dulles' ability to gain access to natural resources of Indonesia came from his skill in political intelligence, unmatched by any of his peers. Indonesia's seething internal political dynamic in the 50s and 60s was being closely monitored by Dulles 2 years after the Kennedy assassination and 10 months after Braden's interview with Dulles. Indonesian politics reached a culmination. In 1965 through 66, Indonesia fell into the lap of the CIA. The national president, Sukarno, was ousted by a military regime and the absolute annihilation of the PKI party. An observer from the CIA described it as one of the most horrific, worst massacres of the 20th century. In Cold War politics, the effect of the horrendous bloodletting led to a significant widening of the split between Moscow and Beijing. Now, this is another aspect of this story that no one ever talks about. Dulles had first confirmed toward the end of the Eisenhower administration that one of their goals was driving a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. And because they have basically infiltrated this quote unquote communist party in Indonesia, in which Sukarno had agreed to work with, they basically made it look like the CIA, that both China and Russia were involved in funding and equipping it. And then when they overthrew the government, their number one priority was to destroy everybody that they could label a communist there, and then point the fingers that the Chinese was blaming the Russians or the Soviets, and the Soviet Union was blaming the Chinese for the debacle, which basically gave bad blood between both of them. And this was all part of Dulles' plan. So, in the twilight of Dulles' career, although he certainly did not retire from intelligence when he was fired in 1961, he was fired in 1963, I believe. No, it was 61. I don't know. We'll get to that part. He incorrectly briefed Kennedy on several occasions, most notably on the Chinese-Soviet split. He did not tell Kennedy that it was real. He left open the possibility that they were playing a game to basically trick the West into thinking that they weren't part of it, but it was Allen Dulles that was at the helm of driving them apart. So he's briefing the president with incorrect intelligence so that he can manipulate the president into doing what he wants him to do, and he can make sure that his surrogates in his real boss, the international syndicate, gets what they want. Kennedy proceeded with his own Southeast Asian policy, in which Indonesia was a very critical part. JFK remained unaware that his plans regarding Indonesia absolutely was 180 degrees different than Dulles' own policy that he had already been pursuing in Indonesia, and was being used as a wedge to further divide Moscow and Beijing. The wedge strategy was first mentioned in 1958 and 59, the Rockefeller Brothers Panel Report, in which both Dulles and Henry Kissinger participated in drafting. 12 years earlier, they had worked together when Dulles was the chief of the OSS in Berlin, and Kissinger was the editor of Harvard University's Confluence. In November 1952, Kissinger visited Allen Dulles in D.C. This was at the old OSS building in Foggy Bottoms. The Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, and the destruction of PKI became the wedge. Moscow and Beijing were both vying for influence over it, which was the largest communist party outside of those two groups. Gaining the support of the PKI or influencing it would have been a feather in either one of them's cap. But when the PKI was physically annihilated in 1965, Moscow and Beijing blamed each other. When Kennedy became president, Dulles did not inform him that what the real deal was. Into this matrix of intelligence entanglements, Kennedy proceeded unaware. When the time came in 1963 to follow up on his intervention in the New Guinea sovereignty dispute with the U.S. aid program for Indonesia, bad relations had erupted between Indonesia and Malaysia. And when it caused a blockage of funds from Congress, Kennedy and Sukarno jointly resolved to bring the conflict with Malaysia to an end. To do this, he and Sukarno agreed to visit Jakarta to a Jakarta visit by President Kennedy. That was planned for basically January of 1964. They both agreed to proceed and make that which would have amounted to the first time an American president had visited Indonesia. Sukarno always described the PKI as mostly nationalist farmers and peasants, which fits the description of every quote unquote communist that the CIA has ever went after. That was the case in Nicaragua. That was the case in Chile. That was the case in, at least initially, even in Cuba. They were nationalist. They were not communist. That was certainly the case in Korea and in Vietnam. While the PKI was the best organized and most effective party, Sukarno explained, only approximately 10% had any hardcore, like what you would now call a communist thought. 90% were nationalist, because Dulles covert planning in Indonesia, which started in the 50s, didn't want anyone to know that fine point. JFK's trip to Jakarta would have posed a massive problem had it proceeded in 1964. It would have consolidated Sukarno's presidency, and JFK would have totally disrupted years of covert planning for regime change being orchestrated by Allen Dulles and the CIA. Basically, Dulles was looking to, even policy-wise, overthrow the wishes of the President of the United States. And when he realized that he couldn't bully JFK and JFK fired him, he chose a separate path. The differences between JFK and Allen Dulles were made even more obvious when JFK's younger brother, Robert, as Attorney General. So you kind of have these two things lining up. You've got the Kennedy brothers on one side and the Dulles brothers on the other side. And obviously that apparatus that was on the other side took out both of the Kennedy brothers. The depth of experience on the Dulles side began as early as the Versailles Treaty, when Allen and John Foster Dulles participated in the negotiations on the American Commission. John Foster in drawing up the reparations agreement, and Allen on the intel side. Allen was always trying to prove that he was at least as good as his older brother. Allen's uncle in the Wilson presidency and his maternal grandfather in the Harrison presidency had both reached the pinnacle of Secretary of State. Yet it was John Foster who achieved it in their generation. And Allen had asked John Foster, and I've read this in several books. Allen asked John Foster as he was dying to put in the good word for him to replace him as the Secretary of State, and John Foster refused to do that. So there was a bitter rivalry after that point. And some suggest that's kind of what drove Allen Dulles in kind of his bizarre fascination with evilness, is that he was much younger, like 7 years than John Foster Dulles. And he always kind of wanted to outdo and prove that he was so much better than his older brother. And his older brother was kind of the shadow of their grandfather, to include moving when the grandfather went to work in DC. John Foster Dulles was allowed to come down with him and often kind of shadowed him around. So, yeah. All right, moving on. John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Allen as the CIA was seen by the media as basically beneficial because, all in the family kind of thing. John Foster followed his father in the Presbyterian faith, attending church every Sunday, and Foster's son did not merely follow his father's religiousness, but also became a Catholic priest and rose to the level of being a cardinal. Allen's religious instructions stopped at the Garden of Eden because he had adulterous affairs throughout his entire working career. He jeopardized his lifelong role in intelligence because, of course, you're not supposed to be able to be compromised. He didn't give a crap. He had so much dirt on everybody, he didn't care. John Foster Dulles passed away 2 years after first being diagnosed with colon cancer. Allen's covert intelligence operation entered an even more radical stage. He and the new Secretary of State, Christian Harder, who replaced John Foster Dulles, who was on crutches because of some kind of debilitating disease, changed the power dynamics in Washington, D.C. for the last 21 months of the Eisenhower administration. It's as if Allen Dulles, with the death of his brother, realized that he had a finite amount of time left too. So he basically stuck everything into a faster gear. He clearly sensed that he was reaching the end of his career. Time was running out for his major project, i.e., Indonesia. And the first part of it was the Outer Islands Rebellion, meaning in Indonesia. And the second part was ousting the Dutch from West New Guinea. Drawing on contacts only Allen Dulles could have had at his disposal, he basically pursued those, which is it's that really, we all talk about the Bay of Pigs, but at the same time, most people don't know anything about Indonesia. And it really was the Indonesia thing that kind of finally tipped the balance for Kennedy, because he fired him on November 29th, 1961. I knew I had the date up here. So he was only the chief of the CIA director, DCI, for 9 months under JFK. However, we all know that he didn't just walk away. John McCone became his replacement. He was an engineer and successful businessman from the West Coast. Unlike Dulles, he had no compunction Dulles had no compunction of assassination or paramilitary force. McCone really wanted to focus on the intelligence gathering of it. And it was he that got the new office in the new building that had just gotten finished after Allen Dulles had gotten fired. So Allen Dulles never actually had an office in the new CIA building. He built it, he didn't get to sit in it. So he returned to Sullivan and Cromwell after he had been fired and went back to representing Rockefeller. Allen had not married into the Rockefeller family, but John Foster Dulles had, so he was definitely related to it. In the years between World War I and II, there were no legal restrictions on someone like Allen Dulles sharing his expertise between private enterprises and the State Department. And John D. Rockefeller, at 98 years old, openly expressed his thanks in a publication called Random Reminiscence of Men and Events. Here's a quote. He did not ruthlessly go after the trade of our competitors and attempt to ruin it by cutting prices or instituting a spy system. One of our greatest helpers has been the State Department in Washington. I think I can speak thus frankly and enthusiastically because the working out of many of these great plans has developed largely since I retired from the business 14 years ago. Unquote. Rockefeller's reputation as the richest man in history was not achieved without the Dulles and them gaining him entry into oil-rich regions, both in the Near East and Far East. When the European colonial powers were still dominant, mining and oil explorations were conducted in the Netherlands, New Guinea, before the World War II by a Rockefeller-based company established by Allen Dulles. It discovered a bonanza of natural resources, and prying them from the Dutch colonial control became an important part of Dulles' post-war covert operations in Indonesia. In the 1950s, Dulles' Indonesia strategy was focused on ensuring West New Guinea changed hands from the Dutch to Indonesian control and became an integral part of Allen Dulles' political strategy leading towards regime change. Because once in Indonesian control, they were going to put their terrorist dictator in charge and steal the resources. The unexpected obstacle created was JFK when he decided that he liked Sukarno. This caused Dulles to cast both of them in a bad light. Despite the fact that Sukarno's anti-colonial, anti-Dutch policy seemed to line up with the U.S. and even Dulles's jargon, what Sukarno nor JFK knew at the time was about the immense treasure that was in Indonesia, because they didn't bother to tell them. Within the first 3 months of his presidency, there's no doubt Kennedy realized that the appointment of Dulles was a mistake. Dulles had snared Kennedy into the Bay of Pigs. He wanted to, and he actually said, we all know, he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Eventually, between it and the Indonesia kind of double speak, Dulles ends up getting fired. It's interesting to note that Allen Dulles, when the crisis first erupted, had taken the precaution of not being in town. And we've already talked about that. We know that he was in Puerto Rico giving this crucial speech, which could have been canceled. And he goes into that interesting tidbit of, basically not being available during one of the most crucial operations there is. The author goes on and talks about how Dulles started his intelligence well before JFK was even born, and that he was obviously still in that business when in 1964, he was the first person announced by President Johnson to be on the Justice Earl Warren's commission to investigate Kennedy's assassination. While both Dulles and Kennedy had worked together, obviously their differences were known to everyone since he openly fired him from being the CIA director. So how you could even get away with appointing him to investigate the death of the guy who he had just worked for and gotten fired is, like, to me, mind-numbing. I can't even understand that. The Indonesia strategy Kennedy was pursuing in 63 was on a collision course with Allen Dulles. The ultimate irony was that Kennedy was unaware of how much his strategy on keeping Sukarno as president was totally at odds with Allen Dulles. The U.S., as the first superpower, had led Allen Dulles to a place where no one had ever been as far as military power, industrial power, and political power, all behind him. Let's see. While still a senator in the 1950s and ahead of the UN Declaration on Decolonialization in 1960, Kennedy's political perspective illustrated to him that he was kind of at the pinnacle of a change in the world, to go from colonial slavery type atmosphere into freedom for the world. And in the New York Times, there was an article that said Kennedy urges U.S.-backed independence for Algeria, which again is another one of those. We've already went through Algeria. We know that that was an Operation Gladio, that the French used the OAS and to basically keep them, fight their freedom, keep them as a slave colony, and basically for the oil, the whole 9 yards. So this is just a reoccurring theme. Kennedy's stance on Algeria and again in Indonesia were confirmation of the previous 5 years of private discussions on foreign affairs. In 1958, Kennedy specifically drew attention to Dulles's covert actions in Indonesia, but did not realize then that when he was president, the depths of his involvement in that country. When Allen Dulles was the top European-based lawyer for Sullivan and Cromwell, the Wall Street legal firm that was virtually the front desk of the Rockefeller oil empire, he managed to surmount the restrictions imposed by the Dutch colonial government. He gained access to the Indies for a Rockefeller company not in a minority position. He had broken through the bar of colonial subservience, an achievement that nobody in Rockefeller Oil's history had ever managed to do. Using his political skill in oil intelligence during World War II, he demonstrated remarkable skill in the OSS based in Switzerland, penetrating Hitler's inner circle of advisors. And in the war in the Pacific, after Japanese troops had occupied almost all of the Indies for 3 years, it was Allen Dulles whom the Japanese first approached before the dropping of the first atomic bomb, when the time had come to surrender. Perhaps the highest accolade, however, came from the spy chief who dominated British services for decades, Sir Kenneth Strong, who declared Allen Dulles the greatest intelligence officer who ever lived. Allen Dulles's interest in the Indonesian archipelago began when it was still a colony, the Netherlands East Indies. So there's going to be a lot of conversation here between the Netherlands East Indies and New Guinea and the Papas. So that's going to be important for looking at the map on where all of those things are and how they interplay with each other, both before, like in the 1910, 1920 timeframe, and what it ended up looking like in 1960. And even after that, because things kept evolving. Okay, so around the time of the end of World War II, 2 days after the Japanese surrendered in World War II, Sukarno proclaimed Indonesia independence on August 17th, 1945. You know, the same way that happened in Korea and Vietnam and many other places like the Philippines. So, the territorial extent of the new country was decided under the supervision of Japanese naval officers. The main person was a guy by the name of Shigtada Nishihima Shigtado. His last name is spelled Shigetada, who was basically described as a plainclothes naval intelligence officer. He was operating under Admiral Maeda Tadashi, Tadashi, and whose house in Jakarta the proclamation was prepared. When the author interviewed Nishima in his house in Tokyo three times while he was writing this book, in 1983, he was 72 years old. He had offered the Indonesian nationalists 3 options. First was they could have the Netherlands, East Indies, plus Malaysia that was currently under Japanese control. Or they could have the Indies excluding West New Guinea, or the Indies including West New Guinea. Only Nishima encouragement was the third option accepted. A principal aim of the entire War of the Pacific was for Japan to claim the island of New Guinea because of its natural resources. The grand plan of the Japanese Navy was to create basically a new Japanese empire in Indonesia. That was kind of like the apple of their eye. After the proclamation of independence, 4 years of fighting ensued before the Netherlands agreed to leave. But it kept the Netherlands New Guinea, which is the western half of the island. And we're going to refer to the Netherlands New Guinea as NNG. NNG. Netherlands New Guinea. So they've kept that part, which is the western part of this particular island. During the war, Admiral Maeda was in charge of West New Guinea. In Japan, he came from the southern region around Okinawa, and after rising to a high position in the Japanese Navy, he helped plan this move to the south and the conquering of Indonesia. During the war, he had already found a large deposit of oil in NNG and was aware of rich mineral deposits in remote locations like the mountain range where eventually the gold is found. Well, it had already been found in the 30s by the Dutch. But when Nishima offered the Indonesian nationalists the Indies with NNG, there was some opposition to including the land of the Papuans. Mohammed Hatta, Hatta, who was declared the vice president of Indonesia at the time of the proclamation, strongly disapproved. Before the war, Dutch colonial authorities had sent Hatta to NNG, where he spent 1 year in exile before being relocated to an isolated island. Basically, he was imprisoned. Unlike Hatta, who was speaking from personal experience, Sukarno, in accepting the offer, was not. The Papuans are Melanesians. I am inclined to say that I do not need Papuans and that it should be left to the Papuan people themselves. I recognize that they have the right to be an independent nation too. Today, the Indonesian provinces of Papua and West Papua, formerly NNG, comprised 23% of the land area of Indonesia. Sukarno and a majority of the nationalists opted to include West New Guinea only because of Nashicima's strong support. At the time, in 1945, the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, which had sought refuge in Brisbane, Australia, during the war, was slowly trying to reestablish itself in NNG, but the wartime commander, Douglas MacArthur, was still in control. According to the official Dutch historians, just before World War II, the area actually was controlled by the Dutch colonial administration, covered only 5% of NNG, and that 95% of that land had never been under the control of the Dutch, ever. So the question should be asked, by what right did Nishijima offer the Indonesian nationalist, excluding Hatta, 100% of the territory that had never been ruled by the Dutch, 100% of the territory of which only 5% had ever been ruled by the Dutch. The other 95% had basically always been free. So clearly something was up with that. One of the famous advisors to Sukarno said some trading occurred, but this was a kind of a disservice to everybody involved. Throwing more light onto this problem might help to explain why Indonesia is still facing difficulty in the land of the Papuans even today. In any case, we're concerned with Kennedy's role in the sovereignty dispute that erupted in the state during his presidency. 4 years of fighting followed the 1945 Freedom Declaration, first against the British, but mainly against Dutch attempts to recolonize the Indies. When that time came in December 1949 to relinquish Dutch sovereignty over the Indies, initial moves to excise the NNG from the Indies had already been made in 1946 when the transfer of sovereignty finally took place. NNG was not included. The real reason the Dutch wanted the territory, its known oil and mineral deposits, are the same reason that Nishijima wanted it to include it. And indeed, it was the same reason Allen Dulles had in mind, without informing Kennedy, that he first introduced the sovereignty dispute to the new president. When the Dutch relinquished sovereignty in the Indies in 1949 without NNG, it was just 3 months after the historic formation of the People's Republic of China. Washington was threatening to withhold post-war reconstruction aid for the war-ravaged Netherlands, and the post-war anti-colonialism had to be relinquished in order for them to get the aid. Indonesia's independence came without NNG. A large primary gold deposit had already been discovered before the war, and the Dutch were in no mood to give it away. In any case, nobody in Indonesia complained because nobody in Jakarta had ever been aware of the huge deposit. Gold was never among the reasons stated by the Dutch government in retaining the New Guinea territory. One can only imagine the reaction of Allen Dulles, who set up the pre-war U.S.-Dutch Company in 1935, which made the gold discovery in 1936, only to have it taken by the Dutch government. With the benefit of hindsight, it's clear Dulles would not be supporting the Dutch in a protracted dispute with Indonesia over sovereignty of the New Guinea territory. This dispute continued through 1950, culminating in 61 and 62, soon after Kennedy had reached the presidency. Dulles should have advised Kennedy about the primary gold deposit, but never did. Under UN auspices, 6 months of Indonesia-Dutch negotiation concluded in August 1962 with the New York Agreement. An American mediator, you guys are never going to believe this, Ellsworth Bunker, whom Dulles had previously asked to be his deputy at the CIA, negotiated the negotiations. continually overruling the Dutch and effectively dictating the terms by which Indonesia took control of the territory from the Netherlands. Compared to the media coverage and political noise surrounding the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy's intervention in New Guinea sovereignty dispute in 1962 and his proposed follow-up visit to Indonesia passed imperceptibly in the news on this region of the world, apart from the tragic episode in 1961 when Michael Rockefeller, son of the governor of New York, disappeared off the coast of NNG. If you guys haven't looked into that, look into that, because supposedly he was eaten by cannibals. This area was part of the larger region known from wartime terminology as Southwest Pacific area. There's like books and movies, Tales of the South Pacific, all of that's written about this particular area. If you guys are into that kind of thing. Indonesia and New Guinea were not the locales that people normally talked about. So I'm going to stop there. We're just getting started in this because this gets crazier the further we go. Anybody want a mic? Come on up. Miles? Go ahead, Miles.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I would like your professional opinion on something. Knowing how we can manipulate elections, and I do think that Kennedy kind of went against certain policies that they thought he was going to implement. What was the urgency? Because they could have replaced him at the next election. Was it like a blood feud to kill him? Were they that upset with him? Why did they have to take him out?
Well, if you look at the timing of things, if he in fact had, and I am told he did, I've read it like in 4 different books. He was going to Indonesia before so first of all, Kennedy was very popular. So he's going to get reelected. All right. Absent cheat. So let's just say he's going to get reelected. And they're going to have to move. And again, we don't have machines back then. So the cheat is a lot harder under those circumstances. So not that they didn't, because they did cheat. But he had made it very clear he was going to Indonesia in January of 1964. Now, 1964 would have been the election year. And if he would have went to Indonesia at the beginning of that year, and peace would have broken out in Indonesia, and he would have discovered that those people were not communists at all, then the entire split between the Soviet Union and China would have went away. It would have undid everything that Allen Dulles had been working for decades to get those in the mines. I have to tell you. So, and we're going to get to this, but the gold mine that was discovered was the biggest in the entire world to date. You're talking probably in today's dollars, trillions of dollars of resources. If Kennedy had went and given Sukarno the boost in his popularity in Indonesia, Allen Dulles would have never been able to coup him without killing everybody in Indonesia. He already killed 500,000 people that they know of, if not 1 million, in deposing him after they killed Kennedy. So Sukarno would have gotten big support throughout Indonesia and most likely would have been able to beat back the attack, because everybody would have known that those people weren't really communist. So literally everything that Allen Dulles had spent since the 1930s in hiding this secret, the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd, they could not let Kennedy go to Indonesia. They could not.
So it was imperative to get him out of the way.
It was imperative. They could not allow him. And they realized once he fired Allen Dulles, it made everything harder for them. He was able to manipulate everything, but with McCone in there, and not that McCone was he was less of a swamp person. Obviously, I think everybody was, than Allen Dulles, but he would not be able to do all of the stuff that he had done with the impunity that he had been able to do it with. I'll just say it that way. More eyes were going to be on stuff. And he didn't control the entire narrative. And see, that's why I think the similarities between Trump and JFK is just striking when you think about that. One of the first things President Trump did was say that he was not getting intel briefs from CIA anymore. He didn't want their daily brief. He didn't want their assessment. And of course, that got spun into, oh my gosh, he's, basically retarded for not wanting, he's going to be blind and blah, blah, blah. When you realize by reading history, actual history, that not a damn thing a president ever got told out of the CIA was for the benefit of the country. It was 100% for the benefit of the international syndicate. You begin to understand that how important Trump coming out, and he just said it. I don't want to be briefed by the CIA. Basically, they lie. That's what they do for a living. So I'm not making my decisions in foreign policy based on their bullshit. And again, he was attacked by it, but it was one of the things that signaled to us that he was there for us and not the syndicate. Mike, go ahead.
I hope I didn't jump the gun for part 3 with my question.
I don't understand what you just said. You hope they didn't what?
I hope I didn't jump the gun.
Oh, no.
Question for part 3.
No. There's going to be a 3 and 4 that I know of, because there's so much information in this book. But no, absolutely not. Yeah, but that's a great question. Mike, go ahead.
Actually glad that Miles, you asked that question, because I was going to ask the Colonel. By the way, good afternoon, everybody. But one thing I wanted to ask the Colonel, or really bring up, is like one of my favorite parts of this book. By the way, guys, like disseminating the information from this book, I'm also reading through it. It's particularly difficult because there's only 5 chapters to this book, and there's so much dense information. I'm having to like take notes and break them up into sections so I can actually like make sense of it all. But one of my favorite parts of this book that I wanted to bring up with the Colonel, and thank you, Miles, again for your question, was that he Polgren goes into just the ratios of how the gold was siphoned out of Indonesia, and being able to hide all of it. And I'm looking forward to the Colonel talking about that, because I think it'll give you guys really valuable insight into just how this international syndicate has moved just in Indonesia alone, hundreds of thousands of tons of gold without anybody really even knowing, because it's not technically documented in the proper way.
And how does that dovetail into the book we did on the Philippines and the gold that was deposited there? And how does that fit into the gold that Hitler basically laundered through the Bank of International Settlements and the Black Eagle Fund? So all of this portends into a much bigger story, which once I started going through this book, I'm like, oh, holy shit. This just dovetails into everything that we've been talking about.
Well, I don't think Poolgrain had he didn't have any idea really of knowing, but I don't think he had any way to fathom how important this book is for detailing just how this international syndicate or the deep state has been able to fund so many of these projects.
Well,
Like on top of that, I don't know about the gold that Hitler ran through the BIS, but like what really came to mind when you started talking was how much gold the U.S. and Europe and the Allies pillaged off of the Nazi regime, and then that wasn't documented or it was stored in like the Knoxville vaults, which we obviously don't know have actually been audited like thoroughly or not.
well, I do know. I did an actual article on my Substack about the gold. Where is the gold? At no time has Fort Knox actually went through an audit. After years of being bullied, they agreed to the only semblance of an audit was done over a 10-year span of time. And it was done one section a year. When you get to the end of the research of how the audit was conducted, that could have been a shell game. It could have literally been the same gold each year being moved to a different chamber.
Colonel, I would almost guarantee it was done that because we've seen it documented how the banks have done that with aluminum.
Yes, yes. So the entire gold subject is huge. But one thing that I want to put out there at the beginning of this, and I want each of you to put this in the back of your brain as a filter, just as we have learned everything about Operation Gladio is a new filter in which to process information. If you look, and he does make this point, which is why I think maybe he does. But when we get done with this, I have his email address. So I am definitely going to reach out to him. And I'm going to ask him if he will not come on a podcast with me, because I would love to be able to talk to him about this. I'm not so sure he doesn't know. And the reason why I say that is he has slipped into the verbiage a couple of different times that it's very interesting to, in hindsight, and most of this research was done in the 1980s. So in 90s, if you go back to, this book was written much later, like in 2020, but a lot of the interviews that he did was back in the day. So if you look at the economies in the 80s and 90s, there was something striking that he said to me that hit me like a ton of bricks. Germany and Japan had the best economies, bar none, because they had shifted the burden of the military-industrial complex onto the United States. So basically, we have their debt for protecting them on our books. The military-industrial complex that was created inside the United States with debt to us was done to protect the losers, and I'm putting that in air quotes, of World War II. Think about that for like 5 seconds. Who won World War II? The Japanese and the Germans, who were the Axis powers, had, in the aftermath of that, completely flipped everything upside down. They had shifted all of their extraneous military production debt onto, for the next several decades, the United States, and to a lesser degree, Europe. But the Japanese was just like totally amazing because, of course, their economy grew by leaps and bounds. They still had the preponderance of the gold in their national bank and in the emperor's palace and his personal bank. And then they went about going back to the Philippines secretly under the guise of construction things, taking all of their Operation Golden Lily gold back to Japan little by little. And so all of that was basically the quote unquote losers. And if you look at, and still today, you have the German as one of the strongest. I mean, it is the engine in Europe. Japan obviously is the, or was, depending on how you want to classify China. I'm amazed by the thought that you, in no practical way can you say that Germany and Japan lost World War II, given the fact that after World War II, there was this mechanism called NATO, of which the Germans basically, for the first 20 years it was around, ran it. And they created these rolling terrorist Operation Gladio infrastructures, which of course came out of Germany. And they used that paramilitary capability to install fascist dictators all over the world. So if you take all of those things, the world looks a lot more like Germany in 1940 than the US in a free republic sense. You've got speech censored, you've got religions under attack, you've got populations being driven through crisis all over the world. So I don't know. I don't think in any measure you can say that we won. Sunshine?
We're following the same developmental path as Weimar on top of that. And I would also say that like the Nazis ultimately won World War II in agreement with you, especially with Operation Paperclip and then just getting disseminated into other major systems and organizations within the U.S. government.
Yeah, my comment has always been that they just changed the tactic and operational strategy. Sunshine, go ahead.
Well, funny that you speak about NATO. That is my next book, Colonel, is NATO's Secret Army, Operation Gladio and Terrorism in Western Europe.
Danielle Gansers.
And, oh, good.
Yeah.
My question actually is, okay, talking about moving the money and moving the gold and all of that, do you think that, like, today, like, the Vatican is still cleaning the money and everything like they were in you know, the 40s and everything when they involved the Vatican?
I would say they could be. I don't know. You know, that's the thing about I focus on the history part of it. There's nothing that changed in the Vatican that would say, I mean, they still physically can do that. They are under an audit that they finally agreed to. Otherwise, Italy was going to withdraw their special treaty that they did that gave them their sovereignty if they didn't agree to an annual audit. But ever since they did that, when Italy found out about Operation Gladio, they failed every single audit. So is that likely? Yes. I don't have any evidence of that, though.
They did also recall all their liquid assets back to basically the homeland or home base. What was it, August of last year or maybe 2 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what that signifies. That would make it sound like they've lost their ability to money launder, which I found interesting given all of the changes with the mafia takedowns inside of Italy that happened in 2019. It could be that all of that led to that. But that's speculation on my part. So, what else? What are you up to, Stellar? Stellar.
It seems like she's busy.
She
I know
must.
she is juggling work at the same time.
Got it. All right. Carrie, go ahead.
I recently learned that just before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Americans did an oil embargo on them.
That is true.
Basically, what?
That's true.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And basically, that's why they entered the war and attacked America. I had no clue that happened. You know everything, Colonel, damn it.
Actually, what I learned today is that the US bullied the Dutch into doing exactly the same thing and cut the Japanese off as well. So I found that interesting.
So I just think that's international syndicate. I don't think that has anything to do with nations. That's just wanting to control to me. And I just want to say I lived in Germany, and you know, it's the international syndicate. It's the fascists that want the power and control. The German people are actually just like the Japanese. They make the most precision things that humans have.
But that's
They're
true. But Carrie,
workers.
that's true with everybody. When we talk about nation states, when I say
Yeah.
Germany, I'm not talking about Germans. I'm talking about Germany. When I talk about the US doing all of this bad stuff, I'm not talking about Americans. I'm talking about America and our government. I do not confuse those two. Generally,
I'm sorry, I just take it a little personal because, you know, I, as Occupy Wall Street, are fighting with, you know, the state there, which we saw as fascist. So I take it a little personal.
yeah, and
Sorry.
understood. And everybody needs to understand that my comment has always been that at the minute that all of us in all of the countries collectively hold hands and stop allowing them to divide us is the exact same minute they all go away, because they can't survive without us being divided. So, all along.
Hi, Colonel.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about Indonesia and the mining, which, you know, was a direct result of the JFK assassination, because JFK was, you know, going to visit Sukarno. Sukarno, as the book shows, you know, was building a kind of special place for him to stay. When he got there, he was totally psyched. And yet Sukarno was anathema to Allen Dulles because, you know, the Bandung Conference, which was basically saying, you know, look, former colonies, we don't have to take either the Russian or the U.S. side, okay, and but the thing is that in terms of international mining, you get these really kind of enormous coups and change of governments in both Indonesia, Brazil, and Congo that are 180 direct results of the CIA coup d'etat of late 1963 in Dallas, Texas, right? Because I think it's kind of important for us to think just what a huge change that was for the international mining industry, which is, you know, really a core part of the global economy and the global international syndicate. Few things are more syndicated than international mining. So I think, like, in terms of the CIA coup in Dallas, it's really critical to look at mining and look at the changes that directly resulted from the JFK assassination and its impact on global mining. You know, it seems as though there was probably major changes there, you know, in terms of market shifting, you know, moves possibly away from more national oriented, smaller syndicates towards a truly international mining syndicate. And I think that, is probably something to look at more closely, from a more economic nuts and bolts perspective and check the numbers on that. The other thing I wanted to say is, in both Indonesia and Congo, you get these huge, genocides, basically, or, I guess you could argue about whether that's the term, but it's just, in Indonesia, the estimate is 1.5 million people who were killed as a result of that 1965 coup that, again, was a 180-degree policy shift from JFK's earlier position, right? And similarly, in Congo, with JFK and Dag Hammarskjöld were both supporting Katanga reintegration into Congo, right? And in Congo, it was, it depends on how you put the killings together, but some say 6 million people died in Congo as a direct result of, the civil war, the manufactured civil war by CIA, the international syndicate, and with Belgium, French, and CIA helping, So I think something that I noticed, as a so-called leftist earlier, is you would think, like, these are huge international genocides. They happen to, to non-white populations, right? Indonesia, Congo, why is it that the so-called U.S., quote, left, unquote, never, ever, ever, ever talked about these mass killings, that definitely have some racism involved in it, right? I wouldn't say that's the primary motive, but, they sure, you would think that an actual left would bring up these mass killings. And I think it's very well worth noting that they're a direct result of the JFK assassination, right?
So
and
hold on a second.
It's no fly zone for our controlled left.
Yeah. So first of all, they would have to know about history in order to put those two together. And we've clearly demonstrated through all of us that the history that is taught in school is expressly to prevent them connecting those things together. That's number one.
Yes.
Number two, I do want to, since we are going to be talking about the mining a lot over the next couple of days, I want to point to the company that we're going to be talking about there, and that is Freeport, Freeport. Freeport is something that you guys should recognize, because Freeport is the same company that was in Chile, and it was the same company that has been in many of our earlier stories about the international syndicate and the role of mining when we were talking about the WWF and people who get concessions in some of these companies. So,
right, including the Whitney's nickel mines in Cuba. The Whitney's
correct. Let me hold on. Let me finish. So I want to point out that in creation of the company, they had mining offices in Louisiana and in outside of New Orleans, but let's just say New Orleans for practical purposes. And that is the company part that was working in Chile. And they are now located in Phoenix, Arizona, the corrupt city of Phoenix, Arizona. one of the world's biggest mining companies that benefit from the international syndicate was in John McCain's backyard. And if you guys haven't looked this company up, I would strongly suggest that you do, because they originally started as Texas Freeport Sulfur Company. So when you start talking about the Texas Bush Jr., the assassination of JFK, all of that obviously intimately involves Texas. And you start looking at some of the people that are involved with the company, you end up with a guy by the name of Vanderlip, Frank Arthur Vanderlip. He was intimately involved in a lot of misinformation when he was a quote unquote journalist. He also was a banker. He ended up as Assistant Secretary of Treasury. He ended up as president of the National City Bank, which we know is all part of the syndicate. And the entire directorship of this company is very similar to him. But the entire, like I said, history of the Netherlands, New Guinea, the NNG, all of that is intimately involved. In the 60s, you have Fidel Castro, who implemented a 25% ore tax, effectively nationalizing and seizing Freeport's nickel mining in Cuba. And let's see. Then it talked about them getting into the Indonesia mining, and it talks about, let's see, there was one other one. Oh, a gold mine in Nevada. And it says in 1985, it had moved its corporate headquarters to New Orleans from Texas, and then eventually it ends up in Arizona. And it says it ends up with, in 1995, RTZ, a predecessor of Rio Tinto, which again comes up in all of our conversations about the international syndicate, made a $450 million investment into the Freeport company. So you have this melding of these international syndicate entities, and it talks about it going into a whole bunch of petroleum acquisitions, and it, let's see, talks about in Africa today, they are in Congo, they are also in Finland, and they're still in Indonesia. And let's see, there's mining in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico. They're still in Chile, Peru, Spain, and Central Papua. There was one other thing. Oh, past board members. You're going to love this. Henry Kissinger, John Hay Whitney, which is a U.S. ambassador, and he was the publisher of the New York Herald Tribune, part of the Whitney family. Robert Lovett, who was a Secretary of Defense under Truman, and Benno Charles Smith, who is a venture capitalist. You have, let's see, the director of Texaco, Arleigh Burke, who was the Navy guy that's in the middle of everything as far as Operation Gladio goes. He was part of the bullshit during the naval, that was part of the Navy during the Korean War. We've come across him repeatedly. Another State Department guy that was intimately involved in the whole Taiwan garbage, J. Stapleton Roy, Godfrey Rockefeller. So you can see the kind of people. And they've obviously had, under the controversy, the human rights record sucks, their environmental record sucks, their safety record sucks. So anyway, not a lot of upside to that. Go ahead, Miles.
Yeah, the other day I had a debate with one of my friends that doesn't know what I'm researching, and he doesn't know anything about Gladio. And he brought up this interesting thing that a lot of people have said in the past. How come these other countries didn't participate in the Industrial Revolution? They never invented anything. They're not worth anything. I went, wait a minute here. Don't you realize that if they were left alone to develop the resources in their region, that they weren't allowed to participate? He didn't really understand what I was saying. I think you know what I'm talking about.
So that's kind of the conversation that I had with a very dear friend of mine, that I mentioned before, about the entire continent of Africa. And, you know, his basic assumption is that, and not assumption, he's very well read, but not from a Gladio perspective, that, you know, basically that his, from his reading, because he used the military approved reading, was that the mantra that Dulles and Eisenhower and all of those espoused is, you know, dark people can't manage themselves. They have to have white people, which is basically what Eric Prince just said. So without white people being in charge of their countries, they're always going to struggle. And that to me is just one of the most profoundly dumb things that I have ever heard anybody say, because we all know collectively that there was an active strategy ongoing during colonialism that they were never going to be allowed to manage their own countries. They were purposely kept ignorant because they were used as slaves and not educated for 300 or 400 years as colonies of Europe. And then once they were quote unquote given their freedom in the 50s and 60s, they were never actually given their freedom. It was colonialism under a different hat, because at that same time, they took places like South Africa, where Israel was funneling weapons into South Africa to basically go throughout the entire continent of Africa and destabilize any of the truly gifted leaders who had been, in fact, educated at some of their European elite schools, who stepped in the void of the new quote unquote freedom that they thought they were getting to lead their country and start utilizing and educate and build medical facilities and all that stuff. And all of them were assassinated using Operation Gladio bullshit, to continue to destabilize the country so all of the international syndicate could continue stealing all of their resources. So if for one time they were just left alone, I would love to be able to ask anybody, you tell me a 20-year period of time when the continent of Africa was left alone without a single occupation of a foreign government, one time, so that we would be able to verify what you just said is true. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, I just also wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier regarding JFK's Algeria speech in 1957, which at the time was like a really huge speech that was recognized as wow, kind of around the world, and all of Africa was very much tuned into that, among other places. And so combine that, basically in that speech, JFK is saying, look, France is going to lose. We're on the wrong side of history in the France trying to keep Algeria struggle, right? And he's putting it in the framework of, decolonization and look, we don't want to be another England and France. And combine that with what he said in 1956 when he was actually on the Adlai Stevenson campaigning for Adlai Stevenson, and he began criticizing both the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of their Vietnam policy, saying, in essence, well, we're going to end up ceding to the Vietnamese just like the French, these new invading replacement colonials. And I'm like, the question comes to my mind, I think, can we imagine a U.S. senator in today's world, or even, say, the 1990s, coming up with a critique that is that fundamentally opposed to the CIA and the Beltway consensus on foreign policy? And I'm like, the point I'm trying to get here at, sometimes we think it's like only in terms of political personality. It's like, okay, JFK, he was different. Yes, but there's also, I think, a sense here in which, the CIA is 10 years old when he made that Algerian speech. And yes, it's not like the CIA came out of nowhere. They had, antecedents, among the high monkey mucks and elites. But today, the CIA is 77 years old or whatever. It's like, I can't, the freedom for a senator to come out and disagree that profoundly, actually, it's vital to a democracy, right? Because if we're electing senators like New York Senator Gillibrand, who just was reelected without a primary in general because he has so much corporate money that the corporations can do better with a mute Democrat than with a Republican. That's how it is. If you're teaching kids with a Senate that is just full of mutes and generates no fundamental debate whatsoever, that's a sign of just how frozen and deeply entrenched the CIA is in terms of all branches of government and all media right now. So it's not simply who, but when. How long has, the CIA been in control of these institutions? And I think that's fundamental to the question of why JFK was assassinated. He was earlier enough, perhaps, where he could get a platform to fundamentally raise differences from the CIA's perspective. And in some ways, I think the way he was assassinated was he made your point that you're making repeatedly, that look, it's not really communism. It's like, let's let countries, free, and they can go with either side, the U.S. or the Soviet Union. May the better side win. And it was almost as if the anti-communism was a propaganda strategy for the domestic U.S. consumption as an excuse for the international syndicate to do whatever the heck it wanted.
So not just a domestic, but it wasn't just a domestic audience. I mean, the anti-communist. Yeah.
Just domestic, but I think that domestic excuse aspect for continued imperialism that was fundamental to why he was assassinated. Because once the Americans' population began to think, "Oh my God, really, if my kid is being sent to Vietnam, I want to think that he's involved in a grand struggle. If the Russians are behind it, then that makes. If it's just some little country where they're fighting for their independence, and JFK is hinting in that regard, that's a major hindrance for U.S. the international syndicates' goals for continued imperialism and for becoming more like the British and French. In essence, JFK called their bluff by saying, "Isn't this really a disguise?"
Right. We do have a few, but it is very interesting to note that the CIA has made it emphatically clear that you're not allowed to contest anything that they say or go against what they say, because if you do, you'll end up like any one of them that has, and they either have a plane crash or they're assassinated on a tarmac in Guyana, or anything else that's happened to several of the sitting senators and congressional members that have attacked the CIA. So they definitely know what the handwriting on the wall is, and you need to be prepared when you do so, that that's part of the potential side effect. So, oh, War Hamster, where are you? This is going to be right up your alley. Sullivan and Cromwell is all over this story. I see him hiding down there. So, anyway, yeah, we're going to be. War Hamster loves Sullivan and Cromwell and Alan Dulles and the whole international syndicate aspect spun around Sullivan and Cromwell. So hopefully there will even be a few tidbits in here for him, but he's pretty much exhausted the research on this subject. I know. But anyway, there is a few tidbits that I learned as a part of this. So, all right. Oh, there he is. You coming up? There he is, the man himself. How long were you hiding down there?
Well, I was doing some work and just listening in the background, and all of a sudden my ears started perking up. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Just busy Monday.
Yep.
Loving the topic. You got a couple of sharp listeners up there speaking today. I've actually been kind of impressed.
Yep. We have learned a whole lot on this 1 year plus journey. And a lot of these people, as you could see with Mike earlier, have taken the initiative as we found these books. As a matter of fact, many of the books have come from suggestions of the people that have been following along on this journey. So I know I tried to get Liza. I know Bridget. I know she's down there. I threw her the co-host because Stellar lost her co-host thing, but she didn't take it. So I see her down there. I'll invite her back up to co-host. But anyway, yeah, I've been very impressed with your knowledge of and research on Sullivan and Cromwell. So when
those guys just seem to pop up all over the place, don't they?
They do.
Before we jump into it, just to tell you just how notorious these guys are, because I know you're not going to go into modern day with them. But if y'all remember FTX, when what's his name got busted for the money laundering,
yep,
the crypto, the first law firm that was called in there to quote unquote clean up the books was Sullivan and Cromwell. And so you knew the fix was in on Sam Bankman-Fried. You knew the fix was going to be in. These guys have been at this game for like 140 years.
Yep. Yep. I think I wrote about that when I just wrote one article on him, just because so much of everything about him when he was first coming out, the Jane Street, the Stanford, where his parents was, his girlfriend's parents was at MIT. And I'm like, holy shit. So everything about the CIA, whether it's Stanford or MIT, massive recruiting. They put them all at Jane Street to teach them a little bit about how the inside of these equity things work. And then they give them, these platforms to go do this garbage, and the whole funneling with his mom into the Democrat, and how he had designed that computer system that basically measured the amount of bang for the votes that you get based on how much dollar. It just was fascinating Yeah, and then in walks Sullivan and Cromwell. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, our good friend goes to base Patrick Henry, made some connections to some British university think tank type stuff they were doing. Oh, I forget what the feel good term they gave it for. Something altruism.
Yes.
Yeah. Gordon did some great work on that, and that was one of the first real big deep research dives he did, and I think he really impressed the heck out of me. He's gone a long way. He's come a long way since then, hasn't he?
Yes, and I did as well. So that entire field out of England, I think I did write something on my Substack about that, but that's been a long time ago. At the beginning of all of this, that was like my second article on the FTX thing, because you can't look at FTX without coming across that entire, and oh my gosh, the tentacles and the money, the amount of money. Basically, they're like, what would be the word? They the Zuckerbergs, and it's like they using an MK Ultra kind of experiment on these people, that they hand them some Department of Defense DARPA project and say, okay, now you're going to be a billionaire, and with your billionaire status you have to do two things. You have to sign up for this, what is the name of that thing? Some altruism. And you have to set up a foundation. And the foundation they don't control. They have to hire international syndicate administrators for the foundation. So they're really not a billionaire. They're a fake. The entire thing's a fake.
Do you know who started the first tax-free foundations in a modern form?
You mean back in the Carnegie days?
Yeah, you know the law firm that set that up?
Sullivan and Cromwell.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Same ones that set up the first modern day U.S. corporation, which is U.S. Steel.
Yes. So it's all fake. The entire thing's fake. There's not a billionaire called Zuckerberg. There is an MK Ultra kid that was said, you're going to sit in this seat, and all of the stuff that is going to be made, we're taking it as part of the CIA / international syndicate, and you're just going to look like you're living a good life.
And let me leave out the fact that that whole operation also ties into dark money campaign funding for the Democrats, and of course, a lot of it came through Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, it's like the gift that keeps.
What do we say? Once you learn how to see it, once you get your Gladio glasses on, you can never not see it.
Yes, that's exactly true.
It's effective altruism.
Effective altruism. That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Mother wrote a book about it.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, we got the altruism part.
Yeah.
Well, Colonel, I can't talk too long.
Sure.
I have some work to get done. I'm buried in spreadsheets right now, but I thought I'd say hello and listen to what you got to say.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming up. We're at 6:00 anyway, so I'm off to go eat dinner. I will be back tomorrow at 4. Thank you all for being here, and we will continue this deep dive into Indonesia and Sullivan and Cromwell and Alan Dulles and all of the side effects of those things. So thanks everybody for being here. And thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. We're going to try to do this every single time and get this video done as well, but definitely want to do it on this particular book and capture all of the information on video as well as on X. So thanks for being here.